Today offers an opportunity to express the debt of gratitude we owe to that first Windrush generation.
Every time I think of my inability to return to the UK, to spend time with my mother when she was ailing, and also when she was passing, I'll never forgive those people for that.
For accepting the invitation to come to Britain.
It is inhumane and cruel for so many of that Windrush generation to have suffered so long in this condition.
And above all, to recognise the immeasurable difference that they, their children and their grandchildren have made to so many aspects of our public life.
They wanted to know what country I was born in, his dad was born in, both sets of grandparents were born in, and then any other great-grandparents. They wanted to know where we were all born. I was like, what is this?
Okay, so this is an important disclaimer before we even continue with the rest of this video. This is not a video designed to criticize any of the people participating in Windrush Day, specifically any of our community's elders who want to contribute any of their personal stories to the narrative, anybody else who is putting forward stories about their families and their own lives, perhaps as children or what have you. This is particularly not criticism aimed at those individuals. This also isn't criticizing you for getting something out of Windrush Day. This is not designed to make you feel some type of way for enjoying the events or for getting something out of them. But, this video will be critical of Windrush Day itself. And because of that, I know that I'm going to be getting people telling me that I'm a hater, that I'm being negative. Why am I focusing on the negative? This is meant to be a celebration day. Stop being a hater, stop being a hater. And to that, all I can say is somebody has to be. Depending on when I record this is me being super ambitious, by the way, because it's like the 19th now. And if I manage to pull this off and upload this on the 22nd, then this will be the fastest turnaround I've ever done for a video. But we'll see. So this video is going to be a little different to what you're used to if you've already subscribed to this channel. But essentially, it's going to be a little bit more observational than usual, a little bit more sort of personal perspectives from myself and some volunteers who've kindly agreed to be interviewed for this video, and you'll see them throughout. But there'll also be loads of historical context and facts flung in there because this is hyphenated history after all. So first of all, Windrush. You might not know, you might know. Don't worry, never fear, I'll tell you what it was. Windrush simply was a ship. Its government name was HMT Empire Windrush. It started life as a German passenger liner, and it was originally called the MV Monte Rosa. During World War II, however, it became a Nazi warship carrying soldiers, and then was eventually used to transport Jewish people who had been deported from Norway, comprising part of a journey that would ultimately culminate in Auschwitz. It then ended up in British hands after World War II and was renamed Windrush after the River Windrush in Gloucestershire. I already have some thoughts about all of this, but I'll try to remember them and come back to them. If not, then maybe harass me in the comments and ask me, what was your point about this ship? Please don't harass me about anything else though.
Caribbean people with Jamaicanness as well. Yeah, a large majority Caribbean island people resonate with. I find it so odd. And you know, Windrush has like a deep history. Went to so many different places in the Caribbean, and you know, has different types of people that were like that were on it. And there's also a lot of people that didn't come on this Empire boat. I think it's very interesting. This day is called Windrush Day after HMT or whatever, His Majesty's boat, Windrush. Like, why isn't it called Caribbean? No, obviously it's not. It doesn't roll off the tongue, but Caribbean Contribution Day or Black British Significance Day. I don't know, but I don't think it's coincidence that this big empire colonial boat is what is rolling off the tongue and what we're told to say. Even, yeah, we know about the Windrush Scandal, but do you know how many people from that same generation weren't on that boat?
So at the beginning of the migration period that we're about to discuss, most of the people moving over from the Caribbean to the UK had actually been either servicemen and women or ex-servicemen and women, many of whom had already been to Britain at least once. The Windrush, however, was not even the first ship to arrive during this time. The SS Ormond had docked in Liverpool in March 1947, and the Almanzora arrived in December 1947. Windrush, however, docked in Tilbury, Essex on the 22nd of June, 1948. One reason Windrush came to be such a dominant symbol, to the point where it's emblematic of an entire generation at this point, was because that was, at that point, the largest number of people from the Caribbean that had ever arrived in the UK. And then the other reason, a primary reason to be honest with you, is that it coincided more or less with the ushering in of the British Nationality Act 1948, which gave settlement rights to any subject of the empire anywhere in the world. But possibly the main reason why Windrush became such a symbol in the way that other ships didn't had to do with the media attention it received. Because by now they'd become somewhat fascinated with the phenomenon of migration from the Caribbean, and on that day in 1948 they made sure to post themselves at the docks, capturing the now iconic footage that in and of itself has become an emblem of the era as well.
Now why have you come to England? To seek a job. And what sort of job do you want? Any type, so long as I get a good pay.
Some will go into industry, others intend to rejoin the services. Their spokesman sings his thanks to Britain.
Now may I ask you your name?
Lord Kitchener.
Lord Kitchener. Now I'm told that you are really the king of calypso singers, is that right?
Yes,
well, now will you sing for us?
Right now.
Yes.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City.
So actually, on that media coverage that I just mentioned, renowned cultural theorist Stuart Hall, himself a part of the so-called Windrush generation, having left Jamaica in 1951 to study at Oxford and spending the rest of his life here in the UK, actually speaks of how media from this particular period of migration is interpreted. In his 2006 essay titled Reconstruction Work, Images of Post-War Black Settlement, he goes over how context matters in how images from this time are read, especially in the present day, and how important it is for us to be able to interpret everything in its complexity and to not flatten the narrative. Today, these images are used extensively, particularly as a source of pride and a symbol of optimism among the generations that followed, a sign of the integration and the better life that was to come from being in Britain. However, at the time, as Hall points out, this was not actually how these photos functioned. Instead, the framing was one of the fear of other, of there being too many.
In 1954, about 10,000 West Indians came to Britain. In 1955, it is believed another 15,000 will make the long journey. Already their coming has caused a national controversy. Plea for controlled immigration was taken to the Colonial Office by Lambert's Mayor, Councillor White. There is an acute housing problem in the borough. 10,000 are on the waiting list, and naturally, a further Jamaican influx is not favoured.
The lovely clothes, the poise and the respectability that we look back on now, especially as it contrasted with the post-war drabness in the metropole of a dying empire, a flex if you will, it actually served at the time as an example of how wrong these people had got it and how they weren't going to fit in. But West Indian people had been raised hearing of a mother country and saw no reason for themselves to feel un-British. They were only confronted with this once they got to this country. In fact, prior to the 1st of January 1973, they were legally classed as citizens of the UK and colonies, and yet here they found themselves framed as a foreign invader. There is a tendency to see this period as the start of a British West Indian identity rather than as a chapter of a relationship and identity that had existed for centuries before. For as long as Britain had been an imperialist ruler, these people's identities had always been shaped by Britishness. Speaking of this centuries-long relationship, the looking for a better life narrative, oft repeated in present-day imaginings, glosses over the inescapably colonial setting that drove the mid-20th century migration in the first place. First, I need to emphasize that the very idea of these nations was an imperialist creation. The fact that they were African and some Asian descended people in the Caribbean in the first place was, of course, the direct result of trafficked slave labor and subsequent indentured labor. The colonial economies in the Caribbean had been designed exclusively for extraction of wealth and not for reinvestment or development of these countries or the people living in them. Pre-emancipation, this was very obviously the case. Post-emancipation, this continued to be the case. And around a century later, i.e. the post-war period, this was still true. Through it all, the African-descended majority were underpaid, subject to brutal conditions, and class and skin colour were and still are inseparable. So from the start, therefore, there had always been a constant transience in the region. During the slave trade itself, Africans were trafficked around the Americas, and in the post-emancipation economy, many continued to move around for work. Many would also join the military for similar reasons. The brutality and lack of investment had been able to remain neglected and particularly extractive, and as long as the British state and owners of the means of production were getting their cut, none of them saw it fit to check in on what the people they'd left in charge were up to. So, 100 years after emancipation, this so-called Windrush era was directly caused by these conditions. A century of freedom, but how much had really changed? Many had also fought in at least one world war on behalf of the so-called mother country, meaning that they were trained in combat, hugely influencing the independence and labour movements. It also meant that they were familiar enough with Britain to see it as a viable option for relocation and that so-called better life. So, whether at home or in Britain, life as a West Indian had always been shaped by Britain the coloniser. The Windrush Day narrative, in my opinion and observation, tends to omit that or only mentioning it in passing so as not to focus too much on the negative. There is no doubt that the people who moved here were committing themselves at the very least to a drastic, if not permanent change, all in the name of pursuing success in life. But in my opinion, the way the pervasive new life narrative is used often misses the part where although many may have planned to settle, many others had no such intentions. The reason why so many did end up settling, whether they'd planned to or not, was because racism blocked them from the majority of industries, regardless of their social class or professions that they'd occupied back home. London Transport and the newly created National Health Service, along with other industries, actively courted people in the Caribbean to come to the UK and build them up amid the devastation of post-war Britain, but they still paid them less than the white workers, a move endorsed by the unions. So they didn't make the money they thought they'd make in the time frame they thought they'd make it, and they ended up having to stay. They were invited to work in Britain, but the British vision was never for this to be permanent, and as well as the unions, the two major political parties had also been openly resistant to the idea of non-white immigrants coming to Britain. And actually, interesting quirk, I've talked about this before in a previous video, my first ever actually, about black nightlife. Watch it, it's good. But even legislative changes at the time were geared less towards attracting people from the Caribbean, Africa and Asia, and more to do with asserting supremacy over its empire in response to legislative changes amongst the original Commonwealth states, specifically Canada's under Prime Minister Mackenzie King. This all in turn coincided with immigration changes in the States, where there had previously been this weird loophole in the xenophobic anti-immigration laws at the time that allowed imperial subjects, like those of the British, etc., to enter more freely than people from other places, especially Asia, obviously. And so America was actually the destination of choice for the majority who left the Caribbean, until the McCarran-Walter Act closed that loophole, and that in turn coincided with the introduction of the British Nationality Act 1948, more or less. So all in all, yes, they were invited, yes, they legally could do so without legal impediment, but were they welcomed? Or was it just a continuation of Britain's need to extract cheap labour from these people to prop itself up, adapting and facilitating the means to do so as society changed? 1968 was the year anti-discrimination law regarding housing was passed. So this was 2 decades after Windrush docked at Tilbury. So, in the intervening period, and afterwards to be honest, many endured squalid and dangerous living quarters, often having to move around frequently due to evictions because social housing providers refused to let to them, as did the majority of private landlords. This is also the reason why at one point, black West Indian people had higher rates of home ownership than the white population, who at this time still mostly rented. The banks often refused West Indian people loans, and so they had to resort to using pardner to save up. Pardner, susu, all the different words, I'm going to put them up on the screen, and an explanation so that we're all on the same page. Because pretty much every African descended group of people, including people in Africa, have a version of this. So you are familiar with it, even if you're not familiar with the word pardner. Anyway, they had to use pardner to save up for their deposits. And funnily enough, to acknowledge Windrush Day this year, the Bank of England, of all things, are hosting an exhibition showcasing pardner, and they frame the refusal as due to a lack of credit history rather than racism. And also, may I remind you that the Bank of England was a colonial financier, and I think part of the reason why they feel so confident to do this exhibition is because they had done one previously explaining their role in the slave trade. But this, in my opinion, was misguided, given pardner was not used out of choice. Anyway, hold that thought. Hold that thought. Mainstream Windrush Day acknowledgement often also omits the more radical end of this period. The popular retelling of the origins of Notting Hill Carnival is selective. It attributes Claudia Jones with having been a founder of the event. She organised events in the area in the 50s, yes, but she was not the founder of this specific event. And also, it completely leaves out the communist, the black nationalist, the feminist parts of her work, and that actually it was even McCarthyism that had her in the UK in the first place. She was born in Trinidad in 1915 and moved to the States as a young child, where she spent the majority of her adult years. However, the US government imprisoned her several times for her communism and eventually deported her to the UK because they didn't want or trust her in Trinidad. Amid labour unrest and the independence movements, the whole Caribbean region was being heavily meddled with by the US and allies to block communism gaining ground. Side note, remember the McCarran-Walter Act that I mentioned earlier? That was what partly enabled and facilitated her deportation, actually. Anyway, there were many in this generation who'd have been considered radical then and now, to be honest, and their presence is almost entirely erased in favour of a narrative that often skates too dangerously close to, if not in full embrace of, docility and with a certain brand of humility that I just don't think is entirely representative.
The framing of it, which I think the campaigners are not doing a very good job of changing, is that we were grateful to be here.
So I've said all of this. How did Windrush Day become Windrush Day? Well, the term Windrush Generation goes back to 1996, of course named after the ship, and it was coined by Sam B. King and Arthur Torrington, the former of whom was actually one of the passengers on the Windrush on that 22nd of June 1948. They both founded the Windrush Foundation. Then, in 2010, Patrick Vernon wrote an article in The Guardian titled Windrush Day, a fitting way to celebrate our immigrant population. Interestingly, his initial proposal was a day to acknowledge the contribution of Black and Asian communities to British life. Patrick Vernon, OBE, was born in 1961 and is a community and educational campaigner and a former Labour councillor for Hackney. He was born and raised in Wolverhampton to parents who'd come over to the UK from Jamaica. Vernon is also behind the 100 Great Black Britons project, which started life as a website and has been turned into a book that can be found in schools up and down the country. Now, while he and others have been campaigning for this since then, it wasn't until 2018 that the first Windrush Day was officially held. Why, I hear you say? Well, it's here that I need to introduce the Windrush Scandal. In May 2010, Theresa May was appointed Home Secretary under David Cameron at the start of the coalition government between Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties. She served as Home Secretary until 2016. As Home Secretary from 2012 onwards, May introduced a series of measures under the so-called Hostile Environment Policy, which actually built upon pre-existing legislation brought in by the previous Labour government, which had included the introduction of the UK Border Agency and the point system by Liam Byrne, former Home Office Minister and current MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill constituency. Byrne is actually the one who introduced the term hostile environment back in about 2006-2007. So named because they aimed to create inhospitable conditions for those without papers, with a view that they would eventually voluntarily leave, I guess, be driven out really. It was deliberately named after hostile environments for bacteria and is part of an established pattern of dehumanizing people and designating them as a foreign body and other by likening them to infestations, infections, vermin or invasions of some description.
We want to ensure that only legal migrants have access to the labour market, free health services, housing, bank accounts and driving licences. And this is not just about making the UK a more hostile place for illegal migrants, it is also about fairness. Those who play by the rules and work hard do not want to see businesses gaining an unfair advantage through the exploitation of illegal labour. They don't want to see our valuable public services paid for by the taxpayer used and abused by illegal migrants.
These policies mandated various agencies to start asking for proof of citizenship, including doctors, dentists, schools, etc.
My youngest son was at school around that time. They kept sending him home a form, which I had to fill out. It was voluntary, so I never did it, but they sent it to me 6 times. And they wanted to know where his parents were from, where his grandparents were from, where his great-grandparents were from. Thank you. They said it was for cultural research purposes. I said, yeah, I bet, I bet. They sent that form with him home 6 times. They sent that home 6 times. They wanted to know what country I was born in, his dad was born in. both sets of grandparents were born in, and then any other great-grandparents. They wanted to know where we were all born. I was like, what is this?
And block people from accessing education, employment, healthcare, social housing, benefits, and pensions. Many became homeless, could no longer open bank accounts, and lost their income, and some were actually deported. The people predominantly impacted by this were from the Caribbean, many of whom had arrived as kids and thus as dependents on their parents' passports, but also included many from across the Commonwealth, including Asia and Africa, and even some EU citizens. The first bit of mainstream attention that this got, however, so remember I told you 2012, and then there had also been things happening from the Labour government. The first time the public actually got to hear about this in any kind of accessible way was a November 2017 Guardian article. Its focus, a 61-year-old Paulette Wilson, who after 50 years of life in the UK and seeing herself as British as they come, was informed that she was an illegal immigrant and was to be deported to Jamaica, a place she hadn't seen since she left as an 11-year-old girl. And the thing is, Paulette Wilson had contributed. She had always worked, she was a volunteer, and she was a beloved member of her community. Yet here they put her in Yarlswood Detention Centre. Prior to this, however, charities and campaigners had been raising the alarm for a while beforehand, like I just said, of the increase in people like Paulette running into immigration problems that they hadn't ever faced before. In the end, it turned out that thousands of people had been affected, and this reignited the Windrush Day campaign, which now had taken on a new dimension in light of all that was being inflicted upon this generation. And so in 2018, Theresa May, who was now the Prime Minister, and the new Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, a man who flies under the radar a lot in my opinion, publicly apologised and promised an inquiry and a compensation scheme.
I take this issue very seriously. The Home Secretary apologised to the House of Commons yesterday for any anxiety caused, and I want to apologise to you today.
As part of this apology, May declared that the 22nd of June was to be Windrush Day, a day of acknowledgement of this generation's contributions to the UK and affirmation of their place in this country. A grant scheme for Windrush Day celebrations was also set up. However, since this apology, the government has been found to be failing in its responsibilities towards the victims on every level. It's a long and complex timeline of events, but the latest developments have us at only about 12-13% of total claimants having ever received compensation, and 23 people have died waiting for justice, including Paulette Wilson, who died suddenly at the age of 64 in 2020. Let me take this opportunity to reiterate, as I said at the beginning of this video, that not everything Windrush related has been done half-assed or cynically. There are some wonderful things that get showcased this time of year. And I might be a hater, but I am not a liar. There is clearly a desire, a curiosity, and investment to know more and connect with Caribbean heritage. In that regard, it is at least successful in getting people to focus and not to take it for granted or invisibilize it.
Unfortunately, because you have a day to celebrate things, people take note, the public take note, teachers take note, and people actually finally get to hear about these migrations. And for me, for the sake of history, for the sake of diversifying history, for the sake of actually just learning some different histories to what's constantly told the rest of the year round, that's the positive.
However, it's the least organic addition to, I don't know, what would you want to call it, our formal celebration calendar, if you will. And from day one, it has suffered from what I like to call chronic EDI work event disorder.
You know, if they needed to do a policy, why wouldn't they have done a new policy that could have been a bit more, you know, sorted or a bit more kind of just developed for our particular experience? So in that case, it makes me just feel like, okay, so you guys are doing it for optics, really and truly, because if Windrush is such like a big part of UK heritage and history and everything, then why are you actually not treating the people that are from that generation or from that, you know, the real people that are a part of that story? Why are you not kind of treating them well in policy where it actually matters? And I think it just reminds me of, like, you know, even at my old workplace, there were so many D&I initiatives and there was just so many like policies that they were trying to put in. But when it actually came to making an environment that people that were different or people that were from other countries could feel comfortable in, like, it didn't trickle down. You didn't feel it. When you think about all of the events that do actually celebrate Caribbean people in this country, like, you know, Notting Hill Carnival, City Splash, all of those type of things, those were all done by Caribbean people. They weren't really from, you know, this funding from like a government like the Art Council or something like that. It was all grassroots movement. So yeah, I just feel it's very I mean, I see through it and I feel like everyone sees through it, but they probably just feel good about it.
It's very interesting having, you know, I've been, some of the work that I've done, we've been a recipient of some of that money. It's really interesting that they're like, you can do this but not this. So you can do the part of your work, for example, that celebrates Windrush Day, so we can have a party, but we can't do the part where we wanted to reimagine what the Union Jack would look like with everyone's contributions. There's so many case studies and examples from so many people where they're saying similar things, so it's very interesting to watch them like control that narrative. Don't be satisfied with like the little crumbs in which they've got, and like don't confuse this on the surface visual representation with like actual work that has happened, an actual change in a general consciousness or in policy. We can see representation of Caribbean people on television and in media all we like, but like none of that matters if we don't have access to like culturally competent food, for example, or just any good food. Like, doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. I'm okay to never see a Black person ever on the television or on the news again if it meant like there was actual policy change, there's actual structural change. And I feel the same way about Windrush Day. Like, I feel like you can erase the Caribbean contribution from every single book, like every single school book, not teach it in schools, if that meant like, I know it doesn't mean, and it will never mean that, but you know, these are things that don't matter. These are not things that are saving our lives. Maybe down the long run, yes, they could save our lives, you know, like when you do teach, unfortunately, when you teach a white person that, you know, other people are human and that they created this whole idea of like otherness and all of these things, like that will save a life. Maybe down the line, someone is a doctor now and can say, oh wait, we should listen to this Black woman, or oh wait, we should like, you know, stop over policing these people. Yeah, it could change lives, but like some of this stuff, it's always just concerned with on the surface.
We don't need 35 of these. We don't need 35 fun days with jerk chicken and soca music. We don't.
Because you see, compared to Notting Hill was born from things the community were already doing and was an evolution of generations old traditions from the Caribbean itself, particularly Trinidad and Tobago. And then you have Black History Month, which was something that emerged during a period of high community investment in Black education and was spearheaded by somebody who'd played a part in Black advancement and education across 3 different continents. Please watch my Black History Month video. You can tell I was brand new at YouTube, yes, but it gives you pretty much everything you need to know in 6 minutes, so I don't know what more you want. African Liberation Day was held on the same day as Lizzie's Silver Jubilee in June 1977 and was organised by community leaders in Birmingham as the start of an international display of solidarity against colonialism. It was the largest gathering of Black people the UK had ever seen at that time. This, of course, would fall under the radical heading I mentioned earlier, so no mention of it this year, despite all the parallels considering recent months in the UK, especially amid the backdrop of royal pomp and ceremony that we've been subject to, wasting taxpayer money on them. Windrush Day occurring in June, a month where other countries use the whole month to celebrate Caribbean Heritage Month, feels both fitting and lacking in comparison, because while events do tend to be scattered across the whole month, it's still only one day and contrasts quite sharply with some of the other events I'm seeing around the world that really take care to showcase the culture as a whole and not just a specific snapshot in history. There's also something to be said for the fact that what drives some of the energy behind Windrush Day is a cultural and intergenerational disconnect, a misjoin if you will, for various complicated reasons.
I don't want to disparage people, but it's just what I've seen growing up in this country. A lot of there's the need to assimilate when you come here. There was the need to assimilate. I mean, my family's Jamaican. My dad's family's Jamaican. My mum's family's Dominican. Now, Dominican, we have a patois that we speak, French Creole. Now, a lot of Jamaicans would no, do not speak like that. Don't speak. If my mum ever taught me that, some of my family would be like, don't speak like that. But then some Jamaican family be like, don't speak patois either, only speak pure English, you know? So it's the need to assimilate into British society to fit in, and also that we don't gatekeep. We don't gatekeep. There's nothing wrong with people learning about our culture. Nothing wrong. There's a lot wrong with people changing our culture, twisting our culture, using it for their own gain, There's a lot wrong with us mocking our culture in order to gain favour, which I see a lot of people doing all the time. But it's been we've had such a huge, I guess the word is contribution to British society, but and now to the point where our own people sometimes are erasing that and putting it down to just being British, just being Black British. And that's not the case. That's not the case at all.
There's a huge disconnect between like people in the islands or people in the Caribbean and people living here. No matter how much we think we know about food, music and culture, or even like speaking patois, like there's a huge disconnect. And not saying that we can't be proud of where we're from, but I think sometimes just like, you know, Windrush Day, just like many things, can like be a way to just like over exoticize our own cultures without actually looking at like what island life is like now, and what does that mean in relation to our Britishness, and what does that mean in relation to like, you know, this hostile environment.
What I've struggled with is, I think that generation, the older generation, my grandparents' generation, they aren't all able to articulate the racism that they felt. And I've heard them say things like, yeah, it wasn't that bad, it was fine, like we got by, we got the house in the end, we got the job in the end, and it all turned out well because I guess maybe financially or in terms of status or the generations that have followed have been okay. And so I kind of find it maybe that in some cases it's hard for them to, or hard for us as the kind of following generation to understand how bad it is within conversations within family. You kind of have to go out and actually do the research for yourself and not necessarily, even though you want to rely on your family and grandparents' stories. But if I listen to my nan, I've interviewed her before for my work, and she was like, yeah, there was no racism. I was like, but nan, they made you retrain as a teacher because they didn't think your qualifications from Jamaica were okay. But she wouldn't put that as racism. She wouldn't articulate that. And obviously it was, but I think they struggle to do that. And I think there's a level of like survival instinct in doing that. You don't want to make yourself feel like a victim because that will maybe make you stop or not be able to keep going. But I think in terms of like Caribbean culture, say today in our generation, it's an interesting one. I think there's a growing presence of people that are also from the Caribbean but not Jamaican. Jamaican culture is always been the loudest here probably because the biggest amount of numbers of people that came, also just because of who we are as Jamaican people, our music, sports, food, it is quite a dominant culture in that sense. So I think when we think about things like Carnival, which I would probably say is probably the biggest iteration of Caribbean culture, some of the other islands get kind of pushed to the wayside, even though Carnival is their culture primarily, and less so of Jamaica. So there are elements of that. I think our culture, unfortunately, has been boiled down to like music and food, and there's very little else outside of it. And I think that is because we have, as Caribbean people, maybe been here for so long, 3 generations. Like a lot of people within my generation, the cost to go back to the Caribbean, for example, it's pushing £1,000. You know, if you've got a family with kids, to do that in peak season summer holiday, because you can't go to Jamaica for like a week, it's too far away. It's really difficult to have that connection back home, which I feel like would help culture kind of stay fixed and us to keep the recipes essentially. It's a difficult task to do, I think. And I think I see a lot of critique of like this younger generation for them not having such a connection to back home, but actually you need to give grace because it's not easy to do that without having the kind of financial means to do so, and the people, the families. You know, if you don't have any family back in the Caribbean, you're going to have to go to a resort or a hotel. You're not going to be able to go back to where your grandparents were born or your great grandparents were born, and that is really sad. But I think it is going to do something to our culture as we move forward. We will be more so, I think, easily identified as a diaspora and less so as, you know, Jamaican people per se.
What avenues or what spaces are there where people can actually come in and see Caribbean culture? Because, you know, you can have someone that has a party, and you know how there's always like conversation on Twitter about no one having their spaces or whatever, and like there can't be house parties and stuff like that. So it's like, okay, well, that means people will actually have to come together to kind of, you know, do the hall parties, hire the halls and things like that, so that people can actually be willing to kind of put that type of energy or that environment on display and have people come over. But I think because things are so segregated as it is, and I think just in general as well, in the Black British, I don't know about you, but I feel like there's like a coming of it, whereas like people are starting to try and figure out like what the Black British identity is, and like where their upbringing kind of stops and then the Britishness kind of starts, type of thing. So I feel like even with those people that say, oh yeah, I'm Black Caribbean, it's like, well, what aspects of Black Caribbean do you know well for you to kind of put on display and to show people? It's just really hard to kind of see where people can do crossovers and where people can kind of share that without there being mocking, if that makes any sense. Because you hear about the stereotypes different groups have it against each other, and there hasn't really been much done to kind of push back on that and to be like, okay, actually there's a British identity, and then what is the difference? Like what makes a Caribbean versus Caribbean, what makes a British person British, and you know. And I just feel like, I don't know, there's a lot of people kind of lean on that Caribbean identity without actually living that day to day.
An event like Windrush Day is for many the only access they have to understanding more about their own origins and their culture and their roots. There are parallels with what prompted the foundation of Black History Month all the way back in the 1980s, a lack of knowledge or pride in self. Britain seems to only be able to celebrate people from the Caribbean when it's time to focus on their labour. The juxtaposition with the two major industries centred in the narrative, the healthcare system and the transport system. In their current state, you've got cuts, low pay and industrial disruption, and a great deal of the people most in need of change are these people's descendants and other Black people. As much as it emphasises the workers, Windrush Day does not tie the present situation with the reality of those Windrush workers that we pedestalise so much and whose circumstances were not that much different, including the strike action, often without the support of racist trade unions.
I think I see or read a lot of there's a distance, I think, between the people that are kind of classified as that Windrush generation, the early migrations in the 40s, 50s, 60s and so on, and the kind of generation that is their children, and then I guess our generation that's the children of those people. It's like there's a very big distance between them, even though they are literally within the same families. I find that the way people speak about what we call as Black now, Black young people, and that older generation that grew up in the 80s and 90s with things like the riots and uprisings across the country, it's like they aren't at all together and aren't a product of seeing their parents go through that level of racism, systemic and covert and overt. I find it a bit uncomfortable at how there's real borders in between the generations, even though we are kind of all part of the same narrative and the same threads of trauma that are kind of feeding through our families. There's an interview I think Darcus Howe did on the BBC in 2011 when the riots were happening, and he speaks about his grandson and his experience with the police, and it's like he so eloquently ties together literally the three generations of his family, himself, his child, and then his grandson that he's speaking about. And it's like, I don't know, no one else is able to do that and put them together. The fact that, someone knowing and understanding what their grandparents and parents have been through is going to lead them to have feelings about Britain and this country today.
I'm now joined by Darcus Howe, who is a writer and broadcaster, and we can speak to him now. And Marcus Dow is in Croydon. Marcus Dow, are you shocked by what you've seen there last night?
No, not at all. I have been living in London for 50 years. There are so many different moods and moments. But what I was certain about, listening to my grandson and my son, is that something very, very serious was going to take place in this country. Our political leaders had no idea. The police had no idea. But if you looked at young blacks and young whites with a discerning eye and a careful hearing, they have been telling us, and we would not listen, that what is happening in this country to them is
Mr.
wrong.
Howe, if I can just stop you, Mr. Howe, for a moment. You say you're not shocked. Does this mean that you condone what happened in your community last night?
I condone, of course not. What I'm going to condone it for? What I'm concerned about more than anything else, there is a young man called Mark Duggan. He has parents, he has brothers, he has sisters, and few yards away from where he lives, a police officer blew his head off.
Well, Mr. Howe, we have to.
Let me finish.
Mr. Howe, we have to wait for the official inquiry before we can say things like that. We don't know what happened.
They have been stopping and searching young blacks for no reason at all. I have a grandson, he's an angel, and he began to think he was coming of age when the police slapped him up against the wall and searched him, and he thought he had now had a gold star. I asked him the other day, apropos of a sense that something was going seriously wrong in this country. I said, how many times have the police searched you? He said, Papa, I can't count.
I also have mixed feelings about how Windrush Day functions to reinforce our Britishness, especially in the way that it emphasises work and contribution. Because on the one hand, we have the age-old deserving versus undeserving dichotomy. The respectability is played up in the emphasis of their employment status and of their toil.
Even outside of the Windrush Scandal, my issues with Windrush Day is celebrating people based on their contribution, based on their labour. I don't think people should just be celebrated because of what they have allegedly contributed to a society. They are human beings, and their migration could be celebrated, full stop. They are a part of British society. They have been for, well, up to 1948, and even before. Black people have been in Britain for a very long time. So I think the fact that it is that portion of people who are literally celebrated because of what they've contributed is problematic.
Much of the narrative assigns value based on work, and to be honest, secretly, there is something that feels as Caribbean, as West Indian, as it does British, because an aversion to idleness is definitely a thing, and the pride in work is real. But here it also serves as an overcompensation, if we're being honest, because amid a backdrop of being falsely framed as lazy, underemployed and feckless, dependent and childlike, never mind the fact that even if they had been idle, which they hadn't been, the problem wasn't a matter of contribution, it was a matter of the government breaking its own laws and depriving people of the human rights and citizenships that were rightfully theirs. Focus on the work? Yes. In my family, all of my grandparents who moved to the UK were employed by the NHS in some capacity for the bulk of their respective careers. And it's something that I personally reflect on often because it can feel like the conditions of black NHS workers are basically the same, which is incredibly depressing to think about. But our elders are more than their work. The conditionality of Britishness is further demonstrated in how high-profile celebrations like this one at Buckingham Palace celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Windrush this year indicate a yearning to be accepted by the establishment, regardless of it being held to account for the things it's levelled at us over the years, or in the Palace's case, centuries. Those who continue to speak on these matters are conveniently excluded from the Windrush Day fold, blocked from accessing those government grants I mentioned earlier, while often those who do get wheeled out as our representatives, some of whom were once themselves known to shake many tables, are now making sure to keep perfectly still, if you will, so as not to disturb anything now that they have a seat at said table. The imperial trinkets have sure pinned them very firmly down in their seats. However, I also don't think that the current narrative goes far enough to show the extent of how our labour and contributions have kept this place afloat for centuries. Here, the emphasis, I have to say, comes from a sense of indignation and entitlement. And yes, let it be known, that entitlement is not misplaced. This place and everything in it is ours, and we are here rightfully. It also belongs to the indigenous and colonised peoples across the former British Empire, and this country is estimated to owe trillions in colonial reparations. The fruits of our labour remain tangible and current, yet because of the way this country is set up, because of a system and a dynamic between us that goes all the way back 500 or so years, because of white supremacy and racism, we are still excluded from most of that head start this place has enjoyed at our expense. No, we are deliberately held back in many cases, like the Windrush Scandal itself, or if we can call it what it really is, government-sanctioned manslaughter. Even with all this being said, if you're going to talk about the labour, then really talk about all of it. The slave labour, the resources extracted, the cost. By focusing on the most recent parts, which are cherry-picked even still, you tell a disjointed picture of what life has been like here since our great-grandparents and grandparents arrived from the Caribbean, as well as their broader context. I also find it fascinating how entire decades are kind of just skipped over, especially the 70s and the 80s, which of course were full of unrest. Remember I said the radical bits are always left out. And I can't actually always tell whether Windrush Day is meant to highlight one specific group of people, one specific period, or whether it's meant to connect that period to those that came before and afterwards. On a separate but related note, on the topic of Britishness, the narrative is, from my observations, a form of nationalism that has really taken shape in recent years. I've talked before about identity, and I'm going to expand on this specific point I'm about to make further, probably a video. But what's relevant to this video right now today is the whole thing of how shocking it was that this specific group of people had been impacted, because it wasn't just about their length of time or contribution. The "we've always been British" narrative fixates more on how much of an affront it was in light of how much they had been assimilated as well, and less on how significant a breach of the social contract and legal contract this incident was. They were British citizens and always had been. They didn't need to prove it by having assimilated or embraced it. They just were British. It also works to exceptionalize them among immigrants, as they were the ones who did it the right way. They were the good immigrants that this shouldn't have happened to, even among their own people. Because you see, West Indians in Britain have never not been targeted by the Home Office. Changes in legislation in 1973 were the nail in the coffin for this period of migration, marking the cutoff for the Windrush generation. But what followed were a series of policies which I won't list exhaustively, but I will use an example instead. That of Joy Gardner, a victim of the Immigration Department and the Metropolitan Police, who in 1993 killed her as they raided her North London home due to her overseer status. Joy Gardner was born in 1953 in Jamaica, and her mother, Myrna Simpson, was actually a part of the Windrush generation herself, having moved here around 1960 to 1961. As she worked, she sent money back to Jamaica for Joy, a barrel child. And while some barrel children were eventually sent for to come and join their parents in the UK, many of whom would actually go on to become victims of the hostile environment, this wasn't Joy's story. Instead, she ended up arriving in the UK as an adult in 1987 after changes in the law in 1981 made it that she was not considered a British citizen despite her mother being one. What the state did to her, how they killed her, how they treated her mother afterwards. I'm deeply concerned with how the Windrush narrative can make it seem like shit is new, and I've just demonstrated to you that it isn't, or how it's cordoned itself off from all the other immigration violence when Joy Gardner and Paulette Wilson, two Jamaican women born in the 50s, both lost their lives due to their immigration status and were more similar than they were different. And this hasn't stopped either and continues to impact us, whether we're in the Windrush generation or beyond.
I've got, so I grew up in foster care, and I got a foster sister, and she's Jamaican. And I didn't know this, but I didn't know if your child was born here, even if you were born somewhere else, that doesn't necessarily mean that your child has this citizenship. So they have to go through the naturalization. I don't know. I was just in two minds of it, because I was like, okay, fair enough. Like, you've got this whole system, bureaucratic system, that everyone has to kind of chip into. Okay, these people need to be identified. But at the end of the day, like, they were born here, they were raised here, socialized here. Like, why do they need to go through these hoops? And it was expensive as well. It was like £1,000 that my sister did not have for those children to get naturalized.
Do you know what? I remember my dad harassing my mother, get your passport, I remember that. My dad used to say to me that he wasn't going to do it because he's a staunch Jamaican and he's not British for nobody. But then he said he's got Pickney that's born in the UK, and what if they just kick him out? So let him go and get his things and make sure everything. And I remember as a child him cussing. I remember argument. My mum said she's not doing it, and it took her long, but she finally did it. She would have been affected around this time. And actually, one of my relatives was affected. My cousins were affected, but they had the means. So because their mother didn't have her British citizenship or anything, even though they had their NI number and they had their British passports and everything, one of them went to get renewed and it couldn't get renewed because the hostile environment kicked in. So they had to sort their mum's passport out, sort their mum's citizenship out, and then theirs got sorted out. But they had the means, they could pay a lawyer, and they got it sorted very quickly, so that it didn't affect them negatively the way it's affected a lot of people. And a lot of people, it affected them because of money. It's because of money. It's because they didn't have the means. I mean, how much is it for a visa? Like £1,200. A lot of people don't have that money.
Personally, I can speak to the fact that I've known people who've had to resort to certain measures to circumvent the system in order for their British-born children to have access to things. I can also say that there were people I remember from back in the day in particular who would casually threaten with calling immigration, and sometimes it was banter and sometimes they were being serious, because that's how much immigration loomed over our community. It was just this sort of everyday reality. So the idea of this now being a new shocking thing that only started impacting us in the 2010s, to me, just feels very strange. None of this came from nowhere. So I mentioned nationalism earlier, and this emphasis on assimilation and having done things the right way and spotlighting quotes on feeling as British as they come, often out of context, by the way. The fact that oh so many of our public figures are activists, are so-called representatives who are wheeled out whenever it's time to remember we exist, many of whom have built their profiles up discussing racism, have been awarded with imperial trinkets, and they tell us that they've received them for us. For us. It's for us, it's for the community, it's apparently going to make our lives easier. And how these MBEs and these OBEs and these knighthoods and these damehoods show that we're chipping away at white supremacy, apparently. But state recognition is also supposed to function as a sign of how accepted we are by Britain. But to be honest with you, all many of these individuals do now is enhance the British status quo. And you're right, sure, they add a little spice, a little melanin to it as they stand smiling next to some member of the royal family. But all quieten down as they take their seats at the table, as I said earlier. Some of them have even played their part in using Black Britishness and our long presence here to construct a narrative that seeks to affirm our place here without too much disruption to British sensibilities. It seeks to absorb us rather than challenge them. This is apparently the pinnacle of British acceptance. And maybe that's one thing I can agree with them on. Because yeah, it is the pinnacle of British acceptance. In fact, the emphasis on acceptance rather than on claiming what's rightfully ours is deliberate. And amid the rise of this new brand of patriotism, especially from the 2010s onwards, the diverse Tory cabinets perhaps being the best known example of what I'm on about, I think this is all related. Anyway, this thought is only like half cooked, so I'm definitely going to expand on it because I think it needs its own piece. Whether I'll write something about it, whether I'll do a video on it, we'll see. The Windrush narrative is colonial in nature, whichever way you slice it. To skip over this is a glaring omission. The likes of the Bank of England, the monarchy, the Royal Mint are able to participate in Windrush Day activities because of this omission. I've already talked about how it sanitizes, how it simplifies the process of integration and assimilation into Britishness. But you know what? Let me be spicy here. It also contributes to the continued misrepresentation of white history. It does so by framing all of this as Black history when it's just as much theirs too, because you see, white history is taught very poorly in this country and it's riddled with glaring omissions galore. Perhaps Windrush Day should also in some way serve to remind them that the very notion of their unity as one singular white group, the basis of their identity formation, is constructed around a contrast with a non-white other. Divisions along class, language, ethnicity, religion, and location, clashes and inequality have always existed among them and continue to be palpable today. But they are distracted from all of this, particularly inequality, through participating in the xenophobic, racist exceptionalism and fear of other that draws a line around Britishness and survives off the demonization of non-British, mostly non-white immigrants and their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids. Xenophobia, as I've talked about at length, is a centuries-old British pastime, but this current brand, heavily steered by media and political rhetoric, began with the arrival of Irish and Jewish refugees in the Victorian era and really took on the form that they know and love today during the post-war years with our Windrush generation, as well as many others who came here from around the world. Now, I'm not suggesting that we as Black people take responsibility for using Windrush Day in this way. No, I'm not suggesting that. But for white people now, a major thing that I can't get past, and it's going to be my last point for today, is how the Windrush is used as the government's carrot on a stick. In several different ways, in fact. First, there is the grant that I mentioned earlier. Only friendly groups can receive funding for safe events, nothing too subversive.
The Home Office is funding some really cool work for some people to do some really cool stuff around Windrush Day. Like, I'm not going to discredit people's work, but you know, Home Office is funding that whilst they're also like deporting people at an alarming rate and not saying anything.
More broadly, a lot of the people who run the various committees, boards and advisory groups are white, many of whom are racist. One of my interviews, I stopped recording when she said this. The local authority, the people the Windrush group in that local authority is led by a white person who verbally announces fairly frequently how much they hate the Windrush generation. And this is in a local authority in London that likes to fancy itself as the hub and the centre of Windrush. And I can bet you that you can guess which South London borough this is. Begins with L. Isn't Lewisham. That's all I'll say. Considering the profile it puts out in the world, I think that is a cheek. Then there are the organisations receiving grant money who have nothing to do with the Caribbean community.
I looked at the funding for last year, who the people that they was given to on the government website. There's 35 charities it was given to. One included Afghan refugees, one of them. The rest of the charities, I went past all, I read the summary of every single one of them, and all of them were about recording the stories of our elders. It was about showing young people about Caribbean culture, which 90% revolved around food and dancing or art. Why is this money? And I'm looking at some of the amounts, 15,000, 12,000, 17,000 given to councils and charities. Why is this money not being put into the people from Windrush themselves? Why have those elders not been given social clubs? How many have their social clubs have been closed down? Why are they not being given healthcare, mental health care? Why has none of that money been used to allow some of those elders to go back to their countries for a holiday and see some of their roots? Mm-hmm. They've been estranged from their countries and their culture for so long. If it's about Windrush, if it's about the travel to Britain, it should be about their journey, whether they want to go back and see their journey or how their journey continues in the UK. There should be an element of education so people learn about Caribbean culture. I agree about that. We don't need 35 of those.
This is part of a pattern because the same thing happens with Black History Month and rather notoriously with Notting Hill Carnival Committee and related organisations. But also, actually, this kind of highlights how confusing the circumstances surrounding Windrush Day can be, because it's Windrush Day and the related grant money for celebrating people of Caribbean descent in Britain, especially the specific post-World War II generation? Or is it a day to acknowledge the victims of the hostile environment, which keeps getting called the Windrush Scandal? They're used rather interchangeably, and those people came from different parts of the world and different generations.
I have an uncle who was refused his passport, and was in Ghana for 4 years. He's so it's my same family that's from the side of my family that's Caribbean, but he's half Ghanaian. And it's funny because from where he speaks and where he's around, everyone would associate him, people even probably refer to him as Windrush. People that don't, because obviously it's that the phrase, the descriptor, that community is now being used to describe so many people that are so many things.
It seems like it's obvious, but I think we need clarity, and I don't want us to be left with it's obvious considering how much things are able to slip whenever it's Black people's stuff. I think we want some specificity. I think we want that confirmed. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I shouldn't be using the word we. Secondly, and for me, the thing that really takes it home is the fact that while all of this is going on, the vast majority of the victims still haven't received any compensation from the scheme. And under Home Secretary Suella Braverman, it's an insult to the victims to take money from the same government that can't compensate the actual victims to celebrate anything without centering them, without using your weight to push their plight forward and demand justice. Yet it's been happening all month. And Windrush Day, while imagined before all of this came out, before it was all revealed to the public, is undoubtedly a consolation prize for what the state did. But where is the consolation? I want to say a special thank you to the 4 people who volunteered to appear on my channel and talk with me today. So there was Deanna, there was Marianne, there was Kelsey, and there was Coco. Thank you so much. And speaking of Deanna, and plug me her podcast, The History Hotline. She actually has an episode and a few more coming up about the Windrush generation, Windrush Day. So please check out her podcast. It's fantastic. Everybody has Caribbean heritage. I thought it was really important to hear from people other than me. This channel is going to be more open and involve more people, as you saw in my previous video and as you've seen just now. I also want to thank my patrons on Patreon. I plan to start writing, so I'm probably going to put all my articles on there first. So you'll be getting some early releases when I do start writing. Watch this space. And in the meantime, let me know what you think. Let me know, especially if you are of West Indian heritage, living in Britain. Tell me how you feel about Windrush Day. Tell me how you feel about some of the things that I've put forward. This was meant to be a relatively laid back format today. We'll be going back to the dense, heavily researched stuff next time. Anyway, you can call me a hater now. You've watched the whole thing, so you can do that now. I'll give you that. I'll give you that. You can do that if you've been waiting. It is hot. It is hot.